As the night deepened and the crescent moon tilted westward, the forest remained quiet, except for the chirping of insects. My uncle, being older, couldn't hold out for an hour and became extremely sleepy, so I sent him back to sleep. The mountain's humidity made the night air damp and cold. Listening to the insects hum, I felt very calm, as if I was waiting for something I already knew would come. Starting at 9 in the evening, I waited for 7 hours. Finally, at around 4 in the morning, a shadow appeared on the slope where I had scattered the pine nuts. My entire body tensed immediately as the figure emerged from the darkness. However, when I took a closer look, I realized it was a mountain rat, plump like a little cat. The rat was rummaging on the slope, sometimes nibbling on pine nuts, sometimes chewing on sweet potato vines, and even digging in the soil with its hind legs. I stayed still and took out the fresh glutinous rice mixed with egg white from the bag. My stomach was aching, not severely, but it felt like diarrhea, making me release silent but foul-smelling gas little by little. It was so unbearable that even I couldn't stand it, and the stink drove away many of the mosquitoes and midges that had been buzzing around me. Before long, a few dark shadows emerged, rustling out of the thicket. I couldn't see colors. It was only under the dim moonlight that I could make out these shadows. They were about 30 centimeters tall, walking upright, with messy horizontal lines on their heads, outlines of straw hats. When these shadows appeared in my sight, I felt a lump of flesh in my left abdomen trembling slightly. It wasn't painful this time, just unsettling. A strange sense of fear welled up inside me, a feeling unfamiliar yet distinctly discernible. It wasn't my own. It was the consciousness of another creature within me. It seemed to be pleading with me, "Stay away, stay away." But instead of fear, I felt an overwhelming excitement. The book said that the golden silkworm goo was a supremely spiritual creature, fearless of wild beasts or humans, but deeply terrified of golden-crowned roosters with sharp claws and the elusive dwarf mules in deep mountains and forests. If goo was exhibiting such instincts, then the shadows must be the long-sought dwarf mules. I steadied myself, waiting for these figures to come closer and stop. I counted. There were 5 of them, hopping as they walked. It was too dark to see their features clearly. Initially, they looked around cautiously, but soon they began fighting over and eating something. The clouds parted, and moonlight illuminated the scene. These legendary dwarf mules had faces resembling a cross between humans and monkeys, covered in green fur. Their arms were extraordinarily long, about 30 centimeters, nearly the length of their bodies. They were noisy, making short, chirping sounds like monkeys in a zoo, sharp yet rhythmic. Somehow, I felt their eyes glowed with an uncanny brightness, filled with an intelligence that was hard to ignore. I waited for about 5 minutes until they gathered closer together. Then, I slowly stood up, clutching a handful of freshly mixed glutinous rice combined with egg whites and incense ash in my left hand and holding a hunting net in my right. I moved forward inch by inch along a pre-planned path, making no sound except for the thumping of my heartbeat. 15 meters, 10 meters, 8 meters. When I got within 8 meters, the dwarf mule suddenly froze and turned to look in my direction. There was no time to hesitate. I threw the mixture of glutinous rice in my left hand toward them. It scattered like rain, falling on their heads and bodies. Instantly, a burnt, acrid smell of scorched rice filled the air. Elated, I recalled the book's claim. Dwarf mules feared fresh glutinous rice mixed with egg whites and incense ash. To them, it was like scorching them with a hot iron. And indeed, the reaction proved the book true. Freeing my left hand, I swiftly cast the hunting net with my right hand. The net, bought from local mountain villagers and meant for catching rabbits, was crude and hard to handle. Despite practicing all day without success, I managed to throw it perfectly in the heat of the moment. The net, reinforced with thorny iron spikes, spread out like a black cloud, falling over them. Unexpectedly, these dwarf mules were incredibly agile. Except for one slightly taller individual caught under the net, the others ducked and escaped in all directions like a flash. The one caught in the net struggled violently, shrieking incessantly. I rushed forward, stomping on the edge of the net, and poured all the remaining glutinous rice. over 2 kilograms, onto its body. As soon as the rice touched its skin, black smoke rose, an almost magical sight. When it finally stopped struggling, I pulled out a red thread and, through the net, wrapped its body tightly. Then, I secured the net further with a thick rope as wide as a pinky finger, ensuring it was well tied. Glancing around, the other dwarf mules had disappeared into the night. The night was dark and damp with dew. Carrying the net, I hurried toward the forest ranger's hut. The creature inside was furry and looked small, but it was surprisingly heavy, weighing at least 30 to 40 pounds. It smelled awful, a mix of burnt, charred scent of scorched rice and a pungent, sharp, animalistic stench of urine. My heart raced to my throat, and my chest felt clogged with phlegm that I couldn't spit out, leaving me choking in discomfort. In the pitch-black night, it felt like the gaping mouth of a devil. In an instant, fear gripped my heart so tightly that I couldn't tell whether it was me or the golden silkworm goo inside my body. My steps quickened, and before I knew it, I had covered the few hundred meters of mountain path without much effort. Bang, bang, bang. I knocked forcefully on the door, hearing my uncle and Li Datsai's voices asking who it was. I identified myself, and soon the lights inside came on. The door opened, and my uncle, wrapped in a coat, stepped out with sleepy eyes, asking, "What time is it? Why are you back so late?" I lifted the net in my hand and exclaimed, "I caught a dwarf mule." My uncle shivered, instantly wide awake, his fatigue instantly replaced by excitement. He pulled me inside, locked the door, and examined the catch under the light. Hearing that I had caught a live dwarf mule, Li Datsai, who had been sleeping, scrambled out of bed and leaned in to look. Under the bright 100-watt incandescent light, I finally saw it clearly. Aside from its wrinkled, blackened face, it almost looked like an old man's face. Its eyes were large and bright, with purplish-red pupils that seemed to be dilating. Occasionally, it opened its mouth, revealing a set of snow-white fangs, densely packed and crisscrossed. Its face and neck had little hair, but its body was covered in shaggy green fur, now mixed with gray-white glutinous rice that looked scorched and blackened. It looked like a monkey with a short tail and sharp claws on its limbs. Its hands had 5 fingers. Most strikingly, it wore a small red straw hat on its head. The hat was woven from red fern roots, rough and crude, like a child's careless handiwork. But if the dwarf mule had made it, it would have been astonishing. The straw hat was shaped like a bird's nest, snugly fitting on its head. It was smeared with white and black stains of sap, dirt, bird feathers, animal hair, and many unidentifiable substances. These looked disgusting, but I was delighted. Carefully, I pulled the hat out of the net and stored it away. After looking at it for a while, my uncle asked, "What do you plan to do with it?" I shook my head, saying I hadn't thought about it. My uncle, excited, said, "Let's take it to the Forestry Bureau at daybreak. This must be a rare species. If we hand it over, we might even get a reward." "Zwa, you're amazing. I've heard stories about these creatures from the elders, but I've never seen one in my entire life. And now you've caught one. Impressive, very impressive." I smiled bitterly. If it weren't for that tattered book with methods for catching dwarf mules, and if I hadn't scattered a few handfuls of glutinous rice, how could I have caught this quick as a shadow creature? If it weren't for that, I might not even know how I died. Li Datsai, standing aside, rubbed his hands anxiously and said, "This dwarf mule is a mountain ghost raised by the earth deity of the forest. We should release it. If it holds a grudge and comes back to take revenge, none of us will survive." "Afraid of what?" my uncle scoffed dismissively. The two argued back and forth until my uncle turned to me for a decision, as I was the one who had caught it. My only thought was to take the straw hat home and gather the necessary items to dispel the goo, leaving me with little interest in their debate. Seeing the two of them arguing, their faces red with anger, I suggested, "Don't you have superiors? Just call them in the morning and ask for instructions." At this, they stopped arguing. My uncle agreed, while Li Datsai, still worried, said nothing. He lit a Jiaxiu cigarette, squatted at the doorstep, and smoked in silence. By this time, it was almost 5 a.m. Summer mornings arrived early, and daylight was only half an hour away. Exhausted from the night's ordeal, I asked my uncle to keep watch while I climbed into bed. Before sleeping, I carefully wrapped the straw hat in a plastic bag and placed it in my travel bag. I was so tired that I fell asleep as soon as my body hit the bed. I didn't know how long I'd slept before I was vaguely aware of a loud commotion somewhere. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but then a warm, heavy hand shook me violently. Struggling to open my eyes, I saw my uncle standing before me, his face covered in fresh blood.